Chris Newman addressing truth and consequences. The story behind me on the board is the story of Abraham's family. In the previous presentation we heard about what happened inside Noah's family and the breakdown that occurred there, and we also discovered that Noah had a heavier burden than Cain, and Cain had a heavier burden than Adam. If Noah failed after a 40-year job with his family, building an ark and the flood and all the other things, the next person who is going to take on the responsibility is going to have a greater burden to overcome the breakdown of his predecessor. And that is the case with Abraham. That's why Abraham's family is a drawn out victory for God and man. Wow, it's a very complicated situation. So God worked through time and relationship situations to establish a victory within Abraham's lineage. If you read the Genesis story, and I urge you to because it's more fascinating than any movie plot, you'll discover that Abraham's details are very complicated, seem messed up, but there's a big pattern in here of a development of the family and development of faith and trust. So I've drawn this in three parts. I put the main players down here on this side, which is Abraham and his descendants. I put in here the archetypal in red, the positions that they were working through. And then over here I've done a bit of an overview of the working out to help you find this sense in this, because it's quite simple in the simplicity of the lineage, and just think of it all as one event, but it's spread through several generations. And the event is a human family, a human being coming back into God's relationship of trust and honesty and integrity. Abraham was known as Abram. He was the son of an idol maker. So he came out of a, shall we say, the satanic Luciferian camp, making idols. However, he had some sort of faith that enabled him to receive insight and instruction from God, and he kept to that. So the first part, the story opens, the first part is Abraham and Sarai, or Sarah, his wife, a beauty apparently, and they were moving through Pharaoh's lands, and Abraham was afraid that because his wife was so beautiful he would lose her. Anyway, to cut a long story short, he sort of lent his wife to Pharaoh, and when Pharaoh found out, he was shocked and handed it back and said, "Don't ever do that sort of thing with me. I'm not that kind of guy." This is a parallel with Abraham being Adam, Sarah being like an Eve figure, and the Pharaoh being like a Lucifer. But in this case, the Lucifer respected Eve and handed her back to Adam. There was no fall or breakdown in that relationship between the husband and wife. Next part of the story is Abraham and Lot. And following Adam's family model, you can see now where we're going. That's a lot like the Cain and Abel situation. And they worked together and they made offerings, you might say. And you read their story and you'll see that it was a good unity between the two of them through some very challenging circumstances, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, so on. Now the next one we've got in the sequence is Abraham. Sarah couldn't have children apparently. Here's another faith issue. So her slave woman Hagar, she gave to Abraham to have a son, and their son was called Ishmael. And Ishmael was in some way a little bit of an outsider because he was not born to the first wife. However, he was like a Ham figure, but in his case he respected his father, and in the end, due to family unity issues, Hagar and Ishmael left the clan of Abraham and lived separately. And it seems that Ishmael was about 19 years older than the next son, who was born to the first wife, Sarah. So this first son, the legitimate son you might say, represents like a new Adam and Eve and family situation here, because this is moving now past this stage of getting past breakdown situations, breakdown problems. Now we've got a bit of a clean start here. So now Abraham and Isaac go through this tremendous drama, and this is where the big burden of the past is clarified. Abraham was asked by God to sacrifice his legitimate first son, Isaac. What a terrible thing. However, the idea was not to murder the boy. It was to take Abraham right to the edge of faith and belief and reality, and see if he stood with God. And at the last moment, when he and Isaac, they were united on this altar in the wilderness, you can read the story, it's got a lot of detail. Abraham's about to sacrifice his son, and an angel holds his hand and says, no, hold it back. You have done everything that was asked of you. So at that moment, Abraham cleaned up all that garbage from the past of Ham and Noah and Cain and Abel and Adam and Eve. The whole breakdown of human trust in God was cleaned up by Abraham's tremendous effort, and Isaac, of course, their unity. So everything before, you can see, all those failures are cleaned, wiped off. And now we've got a new beginning. So Isaac married a lady called Rebecca, beautiful love story. They had twin sons, Esau and Jacob. Now we're going through getting this whole Adam and Eve thing straightened out, and the Cain and Abel straightened out. So Rebecca somehow cooperated with Jacob to trick Esau. Isn't that interesting? You have to understand, earlier we talked about the elder serving the younger, and this is the deep part of that story. However, I won't be talking about it because we'll be here for 3 hours as we go through all of these details. Put that aside. Jacob and Esau eventually united as brothers. It was a bit of a drawn out story, but they did. Then also at the same time, Jacob went to see his uncle to find a wife. Now this uncle was a Luciferian character, a tricky guy. So Jacob had to outsmart his uncle, but his uncle got one on him. But in the end he got 2 wives and a lot of sheep and goats. He got a big flock. He actually overcame his uncle Laban's trickery and succeeded. So Jacob's a bit like an Abel figure now, and he built his family successfully. And then we have the son Jacob and Rachel, and Jacob and Leah, because he had 2 wives. They had 12 sons. Long story there, but the upshot of it is the second to youngest son, Joseph, ended up in Egypt, and he became advisor to Pharaoh. And through him, Jacob's lineage was brought into Egypt, and they became the Hebrew tribes, and that was the future landing site for the Messiah. The new Adam and the rebirth of God's kingdom on earth. Wow, big story. So, this family represents the working out of the fallen nature, purging it out of the family. God's advance through Abraham and his family, step by step, faith in substance. God establishes a foundation within a central person, family, clan, tribe and nation as a base to reclaim his family kingdom ideal on earth. That is the big story of Abraham's family. It's not about Judaism or Jews or anything like that, because these people are not Jews. Abraham was not Jewish. None of them are. It's not about that. It's about humankind. And this is a central group who had enough faith qualities built in through the lineage and through their culture and so on to be a sort of a landing site or a receptive place in a world gone wrong for God's message to begin on earth. But the playing out of that is a big job, because we are so dumb and ignorant and blind and selfish and all these other things which have come up in the course of these presentations. We're beginning to see how the patterns work, and this case here gives us a lot of hope, because it shows how even through a very complicated situation, God could work out through time and relationships and situations and places and so on could work out a very satisfactory beginning and a solution to a huge problem which had grown through the failures of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and then Ham and other people, and descended bang onto the shoulders of this Abraham. And it took a while to sort it, but it was done. So that's why Abraham is called the father of faith, because through his descendants we see a flowering of faith coming out in the way they behaved towards each other and overcame their differences. All of these people worked out their differences in various ways, and each one of their cases is a study on how to overcome particular relationship difficulties. And this one with Jacob and Laban is particularly interesting because Laban's such a fascinating Lucifer type character, and Jacob has to use his smarts to overcome Laban's trickery, and in the end he does. But that's just one little example. Thank you for listening to this presentation. It will take you deeper into understanding what is in the Bible and how it relates to ordinary human circumstances today. And I wish you the very best in your study, in your prayer and your learning. Chris Newman signing out.